1850, Tartaria appears on every major world map. British, French, American, Russian. It's labelled as a distinct territory covering millions of square miles. 1920. The same maps, the same publishers. Tartaria is gone, not conquered and renamed, not divided and absorbed, gone, as if it never existed. The CIA knew about it in 1957. They documented it, they filed it, they did nothing. Why would America's greatest enemy and America's intelligence agency agree on the same lie? Because some secrets are too big for supposed enemies to fight over. August 9th, 1944. The world is at war. D-Day was 2 months ago. The Soviets are pushing toward Berlin. Millions are dying on the Eastern Front. But in Moscow, behind closed doors, the Central Committee of the Communist Party held an emergency meeting. Not about tanks, not about strategy, but about history books. The order that came out of that room was simple. Delete an entire civilization, not their cities, those were already stolen. Not their people, those could be re-educated. Their memory. In 1957, the Central Intelligence Agency filed a report documenting what happened in that room. The document is real, it's declassified, it's public. You can read it yourself. And in it, the CIA confirms that the Soviet Union officially ordered the complete erasure of Tartarian history and its greatness. You don't erase the history of nomadic shepherds. You don't hold emergency party meetings to rewrite the story of primitive tribes. You falsify the history of a civilization that had something powerful enough to threaten the New World. By the end of this video, you'll understand why every major power on Earth, enemies and allies alike, agreed to bury the same empire. The document is titled National Cultural Development of Soviet Ethnic Minorities. Sounds boring, right? That's intentional. But on page 7, everything changes. The decree explicitly orders the falsification of Tartar history. The document continues. It describes how Soviet historians were instructed to remove evidence of Tartar cultural achievements, to downplay their technological sophistication, and to reframe their historical role from advanced empire to barbaric invaders. Why 1944? While the world was focused on the Allied invasion of Europe, the Soviet Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Agitprop, was waging a different war, a war on memory. They were purging the library while the cannons were still firing. So who signed this decree? Who decided that an entire civilization needed to be erased? Meet Andrei Zhdanov, Stalin's right-hand man on cultural policy, the architect of Soviet ideological control. Zhdanov understood something crucial. You can't control a people who remember their greatness. As long as the people of Central Asia, Siberia, and Russia remembered a great Tartaria, a unified, technologically advanced, culturally sophisticated civilization, they would never fully submit to the New World. The Soviet Union wasn't just trying to build socialism, it was trying to replace an entire cosmology. And you can't replace the old gods if people still remember their temples. So what specifically did they erase? Before 1944, Russian and Central Asian historians acknowledged the Golden Horde as a sophisticated state, a period of high commerce, urban development, advanced architecture, and cultural exchange. After 1944, the Golden Horde became a yoke, a dark age, a period of oppression by barbaric invaders. The word horde itself was weaponized, turned from order, as in organized state, into horde, as in savage mob. The CIA document notes that Soviet educators were instructed to teach that Tartars were not indigenous to their own lands. They were being written out of their homeland in real time. Think about the implications. Millions of people waking up one day to textbooks that said, your ancestors, not from here. Your achievements, never happened. Your cities, built by someone else. If the CIA knew in 1957 that the Soviets were systematically falsifying history, why didn't they expose it? This was the height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were in an ideological death match. Every piece of propaganda mattered. Every lie the Soviets told was ammunition for the West, revealing that the USSR was erasing a great empire from history, that they were literally rewriting textbooks to steal an entire civilization's legacy. would have been the ultimate propaganda victory. But they didn't use it. They filed it. They declassified it decades later, and nobody cared. Why? Because the West was doing the same thing. Look at British maps from 1850. Tartaria is there, clear as day. Massive territory, labelled as a distinct region. Now look at British maps from 1920. Gone. The same land is now Soviet Central Asia, or divided into smaller ethnic territories. American atlases, same pattern. Tartaria disappears between 1850 and 1920. The reset wasn't just Russian. It was worldwide. The 1850s through 1940s represent a period where all the new powers, the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union, agreed to bury the old world to legitimize their own new borders, their own claims to technology, their own version of history. They weren't enemies on this issue. They were co-conspirators, co-inheritors of a conquered world. Think about it. The British Empire expands into India and Central Asia in the 1850s to 1880s. Right as Tartaria disappears from maps, the United States pushes west, encountering sophisticated Indian earthworks and architectural sites that don't fit the savage narrative right around the same time. The Soviets formalized the erasure in 1944, but the groundwork was laid decades earlier by the Russian Empire. These powers didn't compete to preserve Tartarian history. They competed to claim it as their own modern achievements. The Soviets said, "We built these cities. We are the advanced civilization now." The British said, "We brought civilization to these backward lands." The Americans said, "We settled an empty wilderness and built from scratch." All three lies, all three necessary, all three dependent on erasing what was there before. So why go to all this trouble? Why risk exposure? Why coordinate across enemy nations to delete one civilization from memory? Because of what that civilization represented. The CIA document uses a specific word, greatness. What made Tartaria great? Let's look at the physical evidence they couldn't completely erase. Every major building in the former Tartarian territories has the same architectural features. Massive metallic spires, ornate domes topped with conductive materials, and geometric precision that rivals anything built today. These aren't decorations, they're technology. Before the electrical grid, these buildings were covered in copper, gold leaf, and metal fixtures. Why? The official story, aesthetic choices, the reality, atmospheric energy collection. The CIA document mentions Tartar achievements. One of those achievements is scattered across every continent, star forts. These aren't just military defences, they're mathematical masterpieces. Their geometry is based on sacred geometry, resonance, and frequency. The angles, the moats, often filled with salt water, a conductor. The positioning on ley lines and high-energy locations. Modern engineers openly admit, we don't know why they're shaped like this. The star pattern isn't militarily optimal, because they weren't built for war. They were built to harness energy. When you map the locations of star forts, pre-1900 cathedrals, and Tartarian architecture, something emerges, a grid. Not random, not scattered, a precise global network. This is what they feared. Not just a lost empire, a lost technology. A decentralized, free energy system that didn't require coal, oil, or centralized control. By 1944, the world had spent 50 years building an economy on fossil fuels and centralized electrical grids. Standard Oil, General Electric, Westinghouse, Soviet electrification projects. The last thing any of them needed was people looking at old buildings and asking, wait, how did they power cities without power plants? So they shifted the narrative. The Tartarians became barbaric nomads. The Golden Horde became oppressors. The sophisticated star forts became primitive defences. And most importantly, the technology became ours. The Soviets could claim, we electrified the East, we brought modernity. The West could claim, we invented the grid, we are the advanced civilization, and nobody would look at a cathedral spire and think, that's an antenna. Nobody would look at a star fort and think, that's a power station. The 1944 decree wasn't just about history books, it was about making sure no future generation would recognize what they were looking at. But here's the question that ties everything together. How do you conquer an advanced civilization that spans a continent? You don't. Not militarily. not when they have superior technology and infrastructure, unless something catastrophic happens first. Look at photographs from the 1800s, from cities across the former Tartarian territories: St. Petersburg, Moscow, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, Salt Lake City. What do they all have in common? Buried first floors, windows at ground level that are clearly second-story windows, doors 10 feet off the ground, entire basement levels that were originally ground floors. The official explanation: poor urban planning. Streets were raised for drainage, buildings settled over time, but when you see the same pattern in dozens of cities across thousands of miles, all from the same time period, you're not looking at poor planning, you're looking at an event. Here's what's documented. Mid-1800s. Massive fires destroy city after city. Chicago Fire of 1871. The Great Boston Fire of 1872. The Seattle Fire of 1889. San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. Always the same pattern. Total destruction of the old architecture, followed by rapid rebuilding. But here's what doesn't make sense. These cities weren't built of wood. The photographs show stone buildings, brick buildings, marble structures. Yet they supposedly burned to the ground. And after each fire, what do we see? Streets raised by 10 to 15 feet. Entire ground floors buried. New modern cities built on top. Then there's the orphan question. Between 1850 and 1920, every major city in America had massive orphanages. The orphan train movement alone relocated over 250,000 children. Where did they all come from? Official history. Children of poor immigrants. But the photographs show something else. Well-dressed children, well-fed, not street urchins, and in numbers that don't match the immigration or birth rate records. World's fairs in the late 1800s featured incubator baby exhibits. Rows and rows of premature babies being kept alive in early incubators. Official story. Medical demonstrations to show new technology. But why were there so many? Where did they come from? And why display them at a World's Fair? Here's what the evidence suggests. A catastrophic event, possibly a series of events, occurred in the mid-1800s. Whether it was a mud flood, atmospheric phenomenon, or something else, it devastated Tartarian civilization and buried their cities. The survivors were displaced, the children were separated from their families, the infrastructure was damaged but still standing, and the new powers, Russia, Britain, America, moved in. They didn't build these cities, they inherited them, they excavated them, they claimed them. The rapid construction of the Gilded Age wasn't construction, it was salvage and rebranding. The orphans weren't abandoned children of immigrants. They were the survivors of a conquered and displaced population whose parents were dead or scattered. Why 1944? This is why the 1944 Soviet decree matters so much. By 1944, nearly 100 years had passed since the catastrophe. The generation that remembered was dying. The buildings had been modernized, the cities had been rebuilt. But there was still a problem. The Tartars themselves. The people who carried the cultural memory, who told their children stories of their ancestors' greatness, who still identified as inheritors of something that the new powers said never existed. So in 1944, Stalin's committee made it official. Delete not just the civilization, but the memory of the greatness. Make sure the next generation grows up believing their ancestors were primitive nomads who contributed nothing. The catastrophe gave the new powers the physical territory. The 1944 decree gave them the historical narrative, and the CIA documented it all, then said nothing. Because by 1957, America had its own cities built on buried Tartarian first floors, its own orphanages full of unexplained children, its own modern electrical grid that looked suspiciously like it was retrofitted into buildings designed for a different power source. The Soviets didn't just falsify Tartar history, they formalized a reset that every major power had participated in. The mud flood buried the buildings, the decree buried the memory, and we've been living in the aftermath ever since. This document has been public since the 1990s. It's been sitting in the CIA's declassified archives for decades, and until recently, almost nobody talked about it. Why? because we've been conditioned to dismiss anything that challenges the official timeline. They'll say, Tartaria, that's a conspiracy theory, but the CIA document isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a government record. It's proof that the Soviets, with the knowledge of Western intelligence, systematically erased an entire civilization from history. The decree of August 9th, 1944, was the final nail in the coffin. It formalized what had been happening gradually since the 1850s, the deletion of Tartaria. And here's the kicker, the erasure worked. Most people have never heard of Tartaria, and those who have are told it's a meme, a joke, a fantasy, but the stones don't lie. The buildings are still there, the star forts are still there, the buried first floors are still there, and now the documents are there too. They deleted Tartaria from the textbooks, but they couldn't delete it from reality. Every cathedral with a conductive spire, every star fort with impossible geometry, every buried first floor, every temporary World's Fair building that took 18 months to build with horse and buggy, they're all still screaming the truth. Your move. You have two choices now. You can close this video, go back to scrolling, and pretend you didn't just see documentation of the greatest historical cover-up in modern history. Pretend that buried buildings are just poor planning. Pretend that 250,000 orphans just appeared out of nowhere. Pretend that the CIA documented a Soviet decree to falsify history for no reason. Or you can start looking. Look at your own city, find the old buildings, look for the buried windows, look for the doors 12 feet off the ground. Look for the architecture that doesn't match the story. And ask yourself, if they lied about Tartaria, what else is a lie? The stones don't lie, the documents don't lie, only the textbooks do, and now you know why.